Well, again, good morning to everyone. Thank you for tuning in, even in the midst of the coronavirus. And thank you for tuning into the issue of trade, which I know has become a more frequent issue, often on the front pages of the newspapers than it used to be. Particularly, I would say, given all of the changes in trade policy over the last 3 years. And I know there's a lot of trade issues that you're going to be hearing about all day today as you tune in. The two that I'm going to really focus on are the World Trade Organization, given a very significant crisis at the WTO, and sort of what that might mean for the rules-based trading system. And then secondly, turning to the issue of Brexit and trying to focus in a little bit on what does Brexit mean for America? I mean, why do we here on this side of the border need to worry or care about Brexit? So let me start with the issue of the WTO. And that may be in everyone's lexicon, partly, again, I'm just trying to move this slide, so I'm going to just see if I can do that. It doesn't look like it's moving, so, okay. So I'm sorry, just 1 second. Let me see if that will work. No, it doesn't. Okay, there we go. I'm sorry. Okay, great. So I thought I ought to start just with a little tiny bit of background on what is the WTO, so that you have some sense of why do we care if it goes away. I think what's critical from my end of it is that the WTO is the biggest, most important, most significant rules setter and rules maintainer in the trading system, given that it has 164 countries, which really means almost anybody that trades very much at all is a member of the WTO. And if you are a member of the WTO, it means you have basically agreed to some very key rules that you have to apply as a member of the WTO. First and foremost of them is that there can be no discrimination among the various members of the WTO. If you charge a tariff of 5% for goods coming in from Germany, you have to charge a 5% tariff on goods coming in from Argentina or anywhere else. And it goes both ways, meaning the United States, similarly, is not discriminated against. We're treated the same as everyone else in the world under the rules of the WTO, unless you're in some kind of a free trade agreement or a special arrangement. It also means that we're committed to not treating imported products worse than we treat domestic products. So if we put a regulatory barrier on domestic products, we can put that regulatory barrier on imported goods, but we cannot single out imported goods for treatment that's less or worse than the same treatment that we would give to domestic goods. So some pretty basic rules saying no discrimination among countries of the WTO or against, in essence, foreign items is permitted under the WTO rules with a few certain exceptions. The second big rule that's part of the WTO that gives it its certainty is that you can only charge the amount of the tariff that you've agreed to as part of a lot of bargaining, and that you will leave your tariffs at that rate that is bound into your schedules, and you will not charge tariffs that are higher than that. So again, that's sort of rule number 2, if you will, of the WTO. The WTO also has a lot of very basic protections for intellectual property, some core principles around protecting patents, trademarks, trade secrets, geographical indications, copyrights are all rules that are part of the base core of the WTO. The WTO also has prohibitions on the amount of subsidies that can be provided in the agriculture area, not more than X dollars. In the United States, that figures $19.6 billion, where we've agreed we would not provide more than that in the way of agriculture subsidies. And last, the WTO has a lot of very basic rules about trade in services, which, given that services are more than 80% of our economy and large parts of everybody else's economy, those basic rules around trade and services are really critical. So we have this bedrock set of principles, and the question is, are people living up to them? Are countries doing what they said they would do as part of their WTO commitments? And I'm sure you've just heard a lot from Myron Brilliant about whether China is or is not living up to its various trading commitments. But again, the issue comes down to who's the enforcer of the rules. And since 1995, so for at least the last 25 years, there has been a binding sense that these rules really do matter, because if one country thinks that we're not complying with our trade obligations, or we think someone else is not complying with theirs, we've been able to bring a case before the WTO's dispute settlement system and have that case adjudicated. And that has been an extremely important way in which all of these trading rules are enforced all the way around the world. The problem now is that the trading system and its rules-based system are in crisis because the United States has blocked the appointment for any new members to sit on the appeals court, if you will. The kind of Supreme Court of International Trade is the WTO appellate body. It's the court of last resort. It's the final decision maker in any of these disputes. It is supposed to have 7 people sitting on the appellate body, and it must have at least 3 in order to have a quorum to decide a case. But the United States has been blocking any and all appointments to sit on this appellate body. So as of December 11th of last year, the appellate body is now without a quorum. So it cannot make any further decisions. And that, I think, again, what I'm trying to talk about a little bit is why does that matter in terms of where does it leave the rules-based system. So let me just focus for just a minute to put into context.
Jennifer, if I could pause you for just one second. We've
Sure.
heard from a couple users out there that they're not hearing the audio. We think
Okay.
it might be an issue on their end. So I'm just going to ask if you're having trouble hearing on the Slido screen, make sure you've clicked on Join with Computer Audio. Yeah, there may be an icon in the lower left hand of the window that says Join Audio. So maybe if you click on that, you'll be able to join in. We've heard this from a couple viewers, but most viewers we haven't heard this from, so we think it's an issue there. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but go back.
No, and if there's something on my end that I can do to help, please let me know that.
Okay. No, you can go ahead though.
All right. Okay. So again, I'm just trying to put this WTO dispute settlement system into a little bit of context. And just by way of saying that, the WTO dispute settlement system is one of the fairly unusual international courts, if you will, that hears disputes between one government challenging something that another government has done. And there aren't all that many government-to-government dispute tribunals. The biggest and most long-lasting one is the International Court of Justice, run by the United Nations. And again, so just to put it into some context, here you have the WTO dispute settlement system that has seen over the sort of 24 plus years that it's been around, 593 complaints being filed before it, with 237 of those going through the full litigation process, resulting in a panel report that is coming down with a decision one way or another of whether or not one country has violated another country's rights under this WTO system. In other words, have they done this kind of discrimination that's not permitted? Have they charged tariffs above the level that they agreed to? Have they failed to provide the intellectual property protections that they needed? Have they done something that has violated the rules of the WTO? If you step back and look at it, 593 complaints filed compared to the International Court of Justice that hears an average of 2.5 judgments per year. So again, by any measure, this is the single most active, busiest, most engaged of all of the international tribunal systems, the international court systems that hear these kind of government-to-government disputes. Sort of interesting to me that the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea came into being 1 year exactly after the WTO. And in the same time period of the WTO hearing 593 complaints, the Law of the Sea Tribunal has heard 29 cases. So again, by way of comparison, this is a huge and very, very active dispute settlement system that every country in the WTO is to some degree engaged in. So how does the system work? It's a pretty straightforward notion. You start out with your complaint going to a panel of 3 people. So these 3 people are going to be appointed from, again, as experts from somewhere in the world, generally not from any of the countries that are the parties to the dispute. So if it's a fight between the United States and the European Union, you will not have Americans or Europeans sitting on that panel. You'll have others from elsewhere, Canada or Australia or New Zealand or Argentina or somewhere else that will be sitting as the panelists. This group of 3 panelists do three things. They hear the facts and try to get their handle around the facts. Secondly, they try to appreciate what is the rules of the WTO that these facts are being applied to, did on those facts, and then third thing that they're deciding is there a violation? Based on the facts that they know, has there been a violation of the rules? If so, they say that in their report, and then that's when that report can be appealed to the appellate body to say, no, the panel got it wrong, and the appellate body then has to render a final determination about whether or not there is or is not a violation of the rules. If there is a violation, the countries are supposed to come into compliance with that ruling, which often means stop doing whatever it was that was the violation. Change your law, change your regulation, change your practice, stop whatever is the violation. If you refuse to come into compliance, then the losing side can be forced to either pay you money to make up for the trade that they've been deprived of, or they can ask for retaliation, meaning that the other side puts tariffs or quotas or something on to rebalance that trade relationship. And that's the system that's been working, that's had these 593 cases so far. Now what's happening though is, and again, this is just giving you a sense of the time frame, these were set up to be done very quickly by international court standards. The cases have been taking longer recently because there have been so many of them. I think everybody is a little overwhelmed by how many cases have been in the system and how complicated many of the cases are. But again, this is supposed to be a quick, fast adjudicatory system that lets everybody understand whether there is or is not a violation pretty quickly. And for the US's part, the US has relied more on this WTO dispute settlement process than any other country in the world. We have brought more challenges than anyone else. We have won 91% of the cases that we have brought before the WTO. So again, while you may hear sometimes the Trump administration make it sound as though the United States has not gotten a fair shake, or that we're always somehow the losers in these cases, I think that the statistics are very clear that the United States has been, again, the biggest winner, if you will, from the WTO system. The problem is, as these bars are showing, the light bars are the cases in which we are the complainant, meaning we are saying somebody else violated the rules. The dark bars are the times in which other countries have challenged us. And I think this is where the Trump administration and other administrations have been complaining that we are, on the one hand, the biggest winners in the WTO system, and on the other hand, when we've been challenged, we have been also among the biggest losers, in the sense that many of our trade practices, and largely the trade practices that people complain about, is when the United States imposes additional tariffs on goods coming into our market. The tariffs are often imposed in the form of what is called anti-dumping duties, or countervailing duties that are going against someone's subsidies, or safeguard actions, or more recently, there have been challenges to the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs on steel and on aluminum, and challenges by China on the tariffs that we put unilaterally on China. Those have been the source of that dark bar where the United States has been the respondent, where people have challenged the United States. And again, many of those challenges, 84.8% of them, they have been successful in saying that the United States, when it imposes these unilateral tariffs, we're not doing it in accordance with the rules either. So again, a very heavily used system, and the US is by far the biggest player in the system. So again, if we look just generally at what's happened in our disputes with China, I don't know whether Myron got into all these details, but again, the US has used the WTO system to challenge China. Again, we've been the largest country challenging China, 20 cases that we brought against China, and various practices in China. We've won all of those cases, all 20 of them. China has then challenged us when we've imposed tariffs on China or anti-dumping duties, etc. Again, China has won, flat out won one of those cases, lost one of those cases, and there's been a bit of a split decision in 3 others. So again, by and large, the United States is, even when it challenges China or is involved in this dispute settlement with China, we've largely been on the winning end of it. So then the question is why? Why did the United States kill, because it effectively has killed this system, by killing the appellate body, it is basically killing this notion that you can get a binding ruling in a dispute settlement system. Why did we do that? I mean, most would argue, and again, I don't know whether Myron got into this, but the Chamber of Commerce, many business and many farm groups would clearly argue that this system has worked to the United States' advantage, and many would question, why are we killing it when we've been the biggest users of the system? And from my basic take on it, really a number of reasons why the Trump administration decided to do this killing of the appellate body. And it stems from, A, that the system didn't turn out how we expected. The idea when it was set up was that the panels would be making their decisions, but that appeals from the panel decisions would be really rare and limited to one or two legal questions where there was a concern that the panel may have gone rogue, gotten it wrong, somehow the panel had been very anti-American, or some bias had been created. And what it's turned out to be is appeals are not rare. Over 70% of the cases on balance have been appealed. Again, they're not limited to one or two little legal questions. Most of the cases are raising 15 or more claims on appeal. So the appeals process has turned into almost a whole entire second set of litigation. Again, the expectation is that the United States would bring and win lots of cases. And while that's turned out to be true, what was not expected was that the United States would be on the defensive end so much, with so many cases being decided adverse to the United States. And lastly, the notion was that the appellate body would not ever be able to add to the obligations that the United States thought it had when the WTO was created in 1995, nor would it be able to take away any rights that the United States thought that it had in 1995. And now the argument, particularly that the Trump administration is making, is that's exactly what the appellate body has done. And it falls particularly in this anti-dumping and countervailing duty area where we're adding on additional duties, where we say we had the right to calculate these dumping duties in a certain way that included a practice called zeroing. And now the WTO appellate body has said, no, you can't do that. So from the United States' perspective, the view is you've taken away the right that we had to impose all of these additional tariffs and trade remedy measures, and now we no longer have that right. So that's not a sort of what we thought we were getting, and therefore we're justified in essence killing the system. So the question then comes, what's going to happen now? Because now the appellate body is defunct, it can no longer operate given that it does not have enough members to do that. So the options are really threefold. One is that if you do not like the result of a panel decision, you simply file a notice of appeal. Because under the WTO rules, while an appeal is pending, nobody is supposed to do anything. You're supposed to simply wait for the appellate body to act, and you do not have the right to claim your winnings. You do not have the right to demand compliance. You do not have the right to say, I want you to come in to compliance with this panel report while an appeal is pending. And given that there is not enough appellate body members, the appeals can arguably pen forever. And that is exactly what the concern is, that everybody will start blocking the system by filing notices of appeal, knowing that there's no appellate body to hear them. And that's exactly what the United States has already done. In a dispute between the United States and India, the United States has already filed a notice of appeal, which has the effect of blocking the whole panel report. And again, the concern is then India is going to turn around and say, well, I'm not going to wait forever if there's no appellate body to actually decide these cases. I'm going to retaliate against the United States. And the United States then says, no, you don't have the right to retaliate against us because an appeal is pending. And the United States retaliates against the Indian retaliation. And we turn every single dispute into a little mini trade war where everybody retaliates, counter-retaliates, on, is the real concern of that's the road that we could be headed down. And certainly from the United States' behavior so far, that's the road at least that the United States is on. Second thing that could happen is that the countries could enter into a pact to say, no matter what happens, I'm not going to appeal because I don't want this mini trade war. I'll just live with whatever the panel decides. Whatever it is, I'm going to take it. And the third thing that's clearly happening, the European Union, Norway, and a whole bunch of other countries are deciding to set up a an arbitration process to try to handle the process through an arbitration. I'm not going to go into the details of how we might be able to fix it, other than to just say, I think a lot of people like me are very worried about this end of the rules-based system because of all the times when there is a perception that we need to have a multilateral rules-based system on everything from governing whether people are going to start putting controls on all of the pharmaceuticals that we need to fight the coronavirus on down. There's a concern that we really do need multilateral rules-based trade to be at the center of all of it. And yet, in the absence of an appellate body and in the absence of people adhering to the rules, it's a real concern. So I'm gonna stop on the WTO and be happy to take questions. And I want to move on to the other sort of main issue that I want to talk about, which is Brexit and why it matters for the United States and what we might see going.
Yeah, let me ask
so if
you.
I can just start with, go ahead.
Yeah, let me ask one question on the WTO, the appellate process. You said that it was expected that the U.S. would be taking cases, but the U.S. wouldn't be challenged in the WTO.
Right.
Why would that be? I mean, why would we expect we wouldn't be challenged?
So again, I think the argument that the United States really was making, for example, to the Congress when the Uruguay Round Agreements Act, which is the law that implemented the U.S. joining the WTO, the perception was that we have the most open market in the world. We have the most transparent set of trade rules. We are already fully compliant with our WTO rules. So what would there be anything for anyone else to complain about? That was the argument that I think there was a lot of sense that that was true, that we do have a very open market, a very transparent market, and that we make decisions that in general are consistent with our WTO obligations. And some of the decisions that the appellate body rendered really took the United States by surprise. There was a sense of nobody expected the appellate body would make some of the decisions that were made. And again, the perception by many in the United States that was an indication that the appellate body just got it wrong, because the perception was, again, we have an open market, we have a transparent market. Again, just to give you one little tiny example of this, one of the decisions that the United States is most objecting to is that we had frequently used a rule called a safeguard, where we could impose duties or quotas on goods for a limited period of time if we were hit by a surge in imports that we thought were threatening a domestic industry in the United States. We could put these safeguards on. The safeguards are supposed to be in place to give a 3-year sort of breathing period for an industry to come back on its feet. We've seen the safeguards used recently in both washing machines and in solar panels. So just those of you out there may be aware of these safeguard measures under what is referred to as Section 201 of our Trade Act of 1974. Well, along came an appellate body decision that said, no, you cannot impose a safeguard measure unless you can show that the increase in the imports was as a result of an unforeseen development, which is old language that came out of the 1947 GATT provisions. No one in the United States expected that phrase, unforeseen developments, to be read into the safeguards laws. So all of a sudden, none of our safeguards decisions were consistent because we didn't make an unforeseen developments finding because we didn't know we had to make one. And it's not part of US law to require this unforeseen developments finding. So again, the perception was we didn't expect that. We didn't expect that decision. We didn't expect our ability to do safeguards to be in any way curtailed, and yet that's what happened. So I think that's, to me, where the U.S. wasn't expecting to be on the kind of losing end. And I will say the vast, vast majority of the challenges to the United States have been challenges to anti-dumping measures, countervailing duty measures, which put tariffs on to combat subsidies, and safeguard measures. That's the vast, vast majority of every time the U.S. has been challenged. It's been because we've put tariffs or quotas on under one of those 3 so-called trade remedy measures, where the other side has thought that the way we did it was not appropriate or not consistent. So that's why we've lost so much.
Okay, let me ask a related, kind of a related question on the appellate process. you said that 70% of panel decisions are appealed with an average of 15 questions or issues on each appeal. How long does that then take the appellate process? How long does it take to get to work through the appellate process?
So again, under the rules, the appeals are supposed to take 90 days, no more. And when I say 90 days, that means the from beginning to end, from hearing everything to holding public hearings, reading all of the briefs, issuing the opinion, and giving the translators time, because all opinions have to be issued in English, French, and Spanish, which are the 3 languages of the WTO. That entire process is supposed to take 90 days. And for the vast majority of the cases, for the vast majority of the time, that's been the case, 90 days. Recently, however, the decisions have been taking much longer. And there were all along a few really big outlier cases, particularly, for example, the dispute between the United States and the European Union over subsidies to aircraft. So a challenge to Airbus subsidies, and on the flip side, a challenge to Boeing subsidies. Those cases have taken longer than the average. Recently, the cases have been taking on average more like 9 months. Rather than 90 days, partly because we were down to only 3 appellate body members, and partly because there was a very long queue of appeals that was not expected. Again, it was expected there would be only 1 or 2 appeals a year instead of 5, 8, 10, 12 per year. So the system is clearly broken down in both timing and in terms of the complexity of the cases.
Okay. So I just want to give a reminder to our viewers out there that you can ask questions through Slido. Once you ask questions, other watchers can give a thumbs up to your questions, and we will take the most popular questions when we go to a more involved Q&A session. But back to you, Jennifer, to talk about Brexit.
Sure. So I want to talk again about Brexit, because I do think this is the other huge development, and part of the reason why I think it sort of goes along with the WTO system is it is yet another example of, to some degree, countries pulling out of or significantly amending what had been major multilateral systems that are now, to some degree, coming apart or to some degree unraveling. So I want to just start with just really quickly, what is the European Union from a trade law or legal perspective, in order to give a sense of why does it matter that the UK is pulling out of it. So as many of you know, the European Union is at its foremost a common market. And what a common market really means is that there are, if you will, the 4 freedoms that are often talked about, meaning there are no restrictions, no duties, no quotas, no tariffs, no restraints on the movement of goods. So all goods can circulate within the EU 28. And again, just so you see on this map that you're looking at, the 27 member states are those that are in blue, red, and orange, or sort of orange colored. But the United Kingdom is the one that's pulling out of this system. So among those countries, there is a complete free movement of goods. So you don't get checked at the border. It's just like driving goods from Indiana to Michigan, free movement of goods, free movement of services. So you can trade in all financial services, any other kind of service can be traded freely among there. Free movement of capital. So again, there's no capital constraints going across all of the European Union, whether you're a member of the Euro zone or not, free movement of capital. And then fundamentally also free movement of persons. So if you are an EU national, you can live and work and move your money, etc., anywhere within that EU 28. The other thing that the European Union is a customs union, which means that all goods coming from outside of the European Union going into anywhere in the European Union pay the same tariff. So if a US good is exported, it doesn't matter whether it's going to Italy or Poland or Germany or Lithuania, it will pay exactly the same duty because it is a common external tariff. Now what happens, and the only thing I threw up here, this map in part because, as you may know, originally the travel ban on the European Union applied to only what is referred to as the Schengen area, which is not the same entirely as the European Union. This is a common immigration system, a customs immigration system that allows people to move freely within the Schengen area. Once you've crossed any one of those borders, you don't have to go through customs services. And originally, the travel ban that the president announced on Friday applied only to Schengen countries, which meant the United Kingdom and Ireland, for example. You could still travel in and out of the United States. Now, again, on Sunday, that travel ban was also moved on to Ireland and the UK as well. But again, just to give you a sense of what is the EU. So then, again, just a little bit of perspective of where the UK sits within the EU system and why does it matter that the UK is pulling out. You know, again, the UK is the second or third largest economy within the European Union. So in that sense, it really matters that the UK is coming out of the EU. And I would say really importantly for the United States, what matters is the UK has been our go-to ally when we've needed to raise issues within the councils of Europe, particularly I would say on trade issues, but on lots of other security and other issues. The UK and the United States have tended to be very closely aligned. And I think it's going to be hard for us to have lost that voice within the European councils. But as a trade matter, again, the UK is a very substantial part economically of the European Union. If you look more generally at how the trade relationship is, the EU is by far the UK's largest trading partner. More than 51% of all British goods and exports go to the European Union. And again, the EU is a significant trading partner on both sides of it. So again, very substantial trade between the UK and the rest of the EU, much more than any other country in the partner for the UK. But if we look at sort of the rest of the picture, again, this just shows you a comparator for how does the United States stand up in terms of trade with the UK versus the EU. And I will say as a general rule, we are, you know, the United States' trade with the European Union is 5 times larger than it is with the UK. Again, in general, the trade as between the EU is much, much bigger than the UK, which is begging the question for a lot of people, why are we starting out saying that the #1 trade agreement that the United States wants is with the UK, when it is a much smaller trading relationship than the one that we have with the EU. But again, just to take a quick look at where we stand in terms of our trade relationships, again, the single largest country that the United States trades with is the European Union when you think of the EU 28 or even the EU 27, in other words, the EU minus the UK, that would still be our single largest trading partner. Now, again, if you think about adding together Canada and Mexico, since they're part of the NAFTA and now the newly USMCA, collectively, Canada and Mexico are our largest trading partner, followed by the European Union. But nonetheless, this just gives you an overall sense of how significant that relationship is. So then if we think about the other piece of every trade relationship is the amount of foreign direct investment. In other words, how much do US companies invest in Europe? How much do European companies invest in the United States? Here, the relationship between the United States and the European Union and the United States and the UK is bigger than any other. Over $3.4 trillion of cross-border investment as between the United States and the European Union. And that investment really matters because most of that means we've got a lot of US companies that are invested in and doing business in the UK and the European Union and vice versa. A whole lot of jobs on both sides of the border, and a lot of Americans are working for EU companies in the United States and vice versa. And so disrupting that trade relationship and that investment relationship by what Brexit means is going to be quite significant for both sides. Again, just to give you a sense of the numbers here on both goods and on services in terms of the relationships. And again, just a much smaller relationship with the UK than we have with the rest of the European Union. Again, just I'll say just general statistics here that give you a sense of how significant these trade flows are and how significant the bilateral foreign direct investment is as between the United States and the European Union. So then Brexit. All right, what does it really mean, both legally and where we're going to end up? So again, passed by the UK Parliament and the European Parliament. So again, a formal withdrawal occurred, has happened. Brexit has happened in the sense that the UK formally withdrew from the European Union as of January 31st. 2020, but subject to the terms of the withdrawal agreement. And what the terms of the withdrawal agreement basically put in place was a transition period through the end of this year. So right now in the UK, you don't really notice any effect of Brexit because as a legal matter, nothing changed. In other words, the UK is still bound by European law, still agreed to abide by European Union law. Trade in goods, services, people, and capital is still completely free as between the EU and the UK. So from a trade and legal standpoint, nothing happened. It will all happen instead on December 31st of this year. That's when, again, the transition period ends and the big changes come. The withdrawal agreement also had what is referred to as the divorce bill, payments that the UK will be making into the European Union, basically to fund all of the things that were voted on and agreed to when the UK was still a part of the EU. Again, somebody described this as it's a little like walking into a bar, ordering a round of drinks for the house, and then walking out without paying. And so the perception of the European Union is, no. You voted to go ahead with all of these long-term spending projects. You can't now stop paying your fair share of them. So the EU will have to continue to pay into that market. It also provides provisions for what happens to all of the UK nationals that are currently living on the south coast of Spain, getting their pensions and getting their health care provided by the Spanish under the EU system, and ditto what happens to all of the many, many EU nationals that are living and working in the UK. And the basic gist is a grandfathering, where everybody in essence gets to stay in place. And again, trade and customs procedures are now sort of being set up, most importantly around the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And as many of you that have followed Brexit may have noticed, this was the huge sticking point all along. This to me was the reason why Theresa May went down as the Prime Minister of the UK, was that she was not able to figure out a fix to this problem. And the reason why it's such a huge problem is that the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland is 310 miles long with 270 crossings by road. And once the UK leaves, the UK, in other words, everything that is dark orange in this chart, is no longer a member of the European Union, so no longer going to be subject to this, free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. But Ireland remains, the Republic of Ireland remains a member of the European Union. And under the general rules of the EU, you have to have a border between the EU and the non-EU, which is now Northern Ireland. The problem is nobody wanted to put that border back up again, because during the Irish Troubles and the whole fight between Northern Ireland and Ireland, the single most attacked, blown up, sources of friction were the border crossings, where, a lot of times those IRA bombs were blowing up the armed UK guards that were standing at every crossing point. And everyone in Ireland and Northern Ireland really resented having to go through a armed border crossing every single time they went between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Every single time these 270 border crossings got crossed, there was an armed British customs patrol officer standing there that checked everything. That was one of the big things that everybody wanted to get rid of. So the problem now comes, what happens? So what Theresa May had done is, in essence, effectively create a backstop border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. When Boris Johnson came in, the big political compromise that he made is to instead put the border effectively through the Irish Sea. So that now goods that are moving from England, Scotland, or Wales into Northern Ireland, even though that's all part of the United Kingdom, are effectively going to be treated as though they're exports. They're going to have a customs declaration. They're going to have to say what their rule of origin is, and they're going to have to pay tariffs going into Northern Ireland. Even though it's part of the same country, they're going to pay those tariffs. And then if they can prove that the goods are not going to leave Northern Ireland, they're not going to go down into Ireland or in any other way be exported out of Northern Ireland, then they can get a rebate on those customs duties. But they have to go through that whole process and make that certification. So it is going to create a lot of, again, need for border checking going between one part of the United Kingdom to another part of the United Kingdom. So again, fairly significant within the UK. For the United States, the big issue is going to be, are we going to get an agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union that continues to allow goods to trade without any tariffs? If there is no agreement by December 31st of this year, what will happen is the common external tariffs from the European Union, which is the tariff schedule that they filed at the WTO, that's going to start to kick in for all of our goods going into the UK. And it means that all of our goods that are going from the UK into Europe will have to pay that same tariff. So again, I've put up this for those of you that are really interested in this, a really excellent interactive database put together by the Wall Street Journal, where you can click on each individual little dot and it will tell you how much trade there was. So again, the farther up on this chart the dots are means the more there is trade between the UK and the EU, and the farther out on the scale means the higher the tariffs are. So anything that's high up and far out means if there is no agreement between the EU and the UK, these goods are going to be subject to a tremendous amount of tariffs and probably a huge amount of trade restriction. Why does that matter for the United States? It matters because, again, if we think about it, and I'm going to use just quickly to close out an example of autos. So the United States now is one of the major auto investors in the UK. Right now, the single most popular selling cars in the UK are Ford, various versions of Ford automobiles. That's the most popular brand, notwithstanding the Land Rover and the Jaguar and Mini and all other UK branded cars. The single most popular car in the UK is a Ford. Ford has 13,000 employees making cars in the UK. Many of those cars are made with Ford parts that are exported from the United States to the UK in order to be assembled in the UK. 80% of those cars that are made in the UK are now traded and sold in Europe. Free, no duties, no checking, no regulatory barriers. Again, they're part of that 4 pillars. They move across that English Channel with nothing. Once Brexit happens, if there is no agreement between the UK and the EU, every one of those cars will now have to pay a 10% tariff, and it will have to be subject to a re-inspection of the car, which could be running anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 per auto. So now all of a sudden, all of this US, UK, US, Europe auto trade becomes very expensive, and it becomes very difficult for any US companies. And I just picked autos, but there's many, many, many other US companies that are doing business in the UK, but a lot of that business is being done in order to trade on into Europe. And so, again, a huge concern, I think, on the part of a lot of US companies about what exactly is the relationship going to be between the UK and the EU. And many of them wanting to know that before we figure out whether we can and should have a free trade agreement between the United States and the UK. Having said all of that, I mean, right now, again, the US and the UK negotiators are beginning the process of trying to reach an agreement between the United States and the UK for some kind of a free trade arrangement. We are also currently in the throes of some discussions, at least, with the European Union about whether we could do any kind of a trade agreement with the EU. I will say all of those negotiations are taking place, obviously, against the very difficult backdrop of what do we make of the coronavirus, but also against the backdrop of a lot of other trade frictions right now. For example, the United States has said and sent 3 or 4 or 5 delegations over to the UK to say, do not allow Huawei into your 5G networks. And if you do that, that's going to be a huge trade issue between the United States and the UK. And Boris Johnson decided to let Huawei in to a significant part of the UK's 5G network. So again, all of a sudden the United States is in a very difficult position in terms of how it's thinking about its trade relationship with the UK, given that right out of the box, this becomes a significant deterrent. If we flip over and think about, are we going to get a trade agreement with the EU? we currently are in a pretty precarious state in terms of our trade relationship with the European Union. New leadership in the European Union and the new head of the European Union, Mrs. van der Leyen, has said she very much wants an agreement with the United States and would like it quickly. But we have tariffs on European steel, 25%. We have tariffs on European aluminum, 10%. We have tariffs on $7.5 billion worth of European Union goods because of our retaliation against their subsidies for Airbus. The European Union is pretty soon going to be imposing tariffs on the United States in response to our subsidies for Boeing. And we have a very fraught relationship, again, also around the issue of Huawei, given that a number of the European countries have also let Huawei in. The French have put a tax on digital services, which has been held in abeyance in terms of they're not actually collecting it until December 31st, but that remains out there as a huge potential trade irritant between the United States and the European Union. So we're in the process of trying to reach these agreements, but against the backdrop of a lot of real difficulties, and then against this backdrop of, from the United States' perspective, probably really needing to know what is the relationship going to be between the EU and the UK before we can really know how significant any agreements we might enter into might be, depending on what that fundamental relationship is. So maybe I'll stop there and see what kind of questions there might be.
Yeah, so we have a handful of questions dealing with the issue of the day, obviously. Coronavirus. Will coronavirus travel bans drive a permanent wedge between the US and EU or among the European countries, or is this only a temporary problem? And related questions also on the coronavirus and travel bans. Can the EU sue the US over travel bans?
No, or put it this way, I don't think, so let me start with can the EU sue the United States over travel bans? I think the answer is no, or certainly I think the chances of them winning a travel ban dispute with the United States are virtually non-existent. Within the WTO rules, there are two huge exceptions where you can break all of your commitments if you're doing so under a series of exceptions. And one of the clear exceptions is to protect the life and health of people, animals, and plants. So in other words, if it's done in order to protect your food growing sources, or more importantly, your people, you're allowed to break all of your WTO commitments. So I think there's no chance that you could say you're not allowed to do a travel ban because you're doing so to protect the life and health of your people. How permanent this will be, I think, is way too early to tell. Obviously, the immediate concerns on the trade side with the coronavirus is that the United States still has in place a huge number of tariffs on medical supplies coming out of China, which is the #1 source of a huge number of the active ingredients in many, many pharmaceuticals are coming out of China. And we've put 25% tariffs on most of the goods coming in from China. A very few of them were lifted very recently, just in the last, on the 10th and the 12th of March, fairly quietly, the United States granted some exemptions for some of the product coming in from China. But China is the major source for masks, for surgical gloves, for respirators, for ventilators, and again, for the active ingredients in significant numbers of pharmaceuticals. So on the trade front, it's very clear that at least at a minimum, we are going to need to really rethink whether or not we want to keep these 25% tariffs on so much of the goods that we need. The European Union has recently thought about engaging in export controls, meaning they're going to block exports going out of Europe of medical supplies in order to try to keep them all at home. And so both on the issue of whether or not we should be blocking goods coming in from China, and on the general issue of whether all countries are going to start creating export bans, everybody's going to start hoarding for their own people, that's going to become, I think, the huge trade issue more than the travel bans, is going to be whether and how countries think about challenging one another if you're engaging in banning the export of all the goods that you think you want to keep at home for your people. Can you do it legally? Yes. Should you do it? Probably not. In the sense that we're going to need some global coordination about making sure that the medical supplies get to where they're needed most. But again, I think that's where we're headed.
Now, on that, you mentioned the medical supplies, the gloves and the masks that are being produced coming from China. Are they still making those, or has their capacity to produce these items gone down?
My understanding is their capacity went down for a while, but many of the places have come back up online. At least, quite a number of them. And again, just to give you a sense of it. So the ones that are subject to the 25% tariffs, that are really critical for us are, again, disposable medical headwear. So that includes the masks, thermometers, ultrasound systems, oxygen concentrators, hand sanitizers, etc. So we're heavily reliant on China for a number of those. A number of the other items are subject to a smaller tariff, the 7.5% tariff. So again, really importantly, 72% of our imports of personal protective equipment. So this is, again, the suits that our first responders that are on the front lines of this are wearing. 72% of those imports are coming in from China. Protective goggles that everyone is wearing while they're checking whether or not you have COVID-19, you'll see those protective goggles. Again, 55% of those imports are coming from China. Other medical headgear, 50% coming from China. So again, we have, protective medical clothing, sterile gloves. Again, those are heavily sourced out of China. My understanding is much of that is coming back online. The Chinese are currently exporting a fair amount of that. Again, one of the major, Chinese executives, the head of, Alibaba, Jack Ma, has just donated a huge shipment of those that are coming into the United States. And the Chinese are also shipping free, again, into Italy to try to help the Italians out. So the Chinese are very much stepping up to try to export every bit that they possibly can to help both the United States and Italy. The problem is on our end, we're still charging them these extra duties, which, again, all of our hospitals and medical providers are still paying. So my own sense is I think we need at a bare minimum to consider lifting those duties immediately on Chinese imports.
Okay, so we are lucky to have a non-coronavirus question.
Okay.
What's your view of the proposed French tax on tech? Isn't it reasonable for countries to tax online businesses just as offline businesses?
Yeah, so again, this is a huge, I think one of the big coming fights is over taxation of digital products and digital services. And obviously the Europeans have led the way in the sense of their perception is that we should be able to do this tax. It's very complicated. Again, it's the subject of, we've had forever and ever, we've had we've had bilateral tax treaties where there have been treaties across the globe to try to prevent the double taxation of income. And what has happened is a perception that digital products are somehow escaping a fair amount of tax. And so the perception is, wait a minute, you're making all this money by every click and every advertisement and everything else. You're effectively making money on French citizens that are looking at Google or Facebook or any of these other platforms. Why shouldn't France be able to tax that? And so the French have gone ahead and said, we're going to put this 3% tax on. The problem, I think, from many perspectives is that there does need to be a global multilateral conversation about where is it fair to do this taxing, because the perception is if France puts on a 3% tax and Germany puts on a 3% tax and everybody else in the world puts on a 3% tax, at some level, Google won't have any revenue to tax. I mean, we have to all come up with some collective system that's supposed to be being done at the OECD, the Organization for the Cooperation and Economic Development in Paris. I'm dubious whether they can actually come up with an agreement by December 31st, which is when this French tax kicks in. I think the main argument that the United States has made against it is that it's discriminatory because the tax only applies if you have a certain amount of revenue, a very high amount of revenue. So that effectively the only companies that actually have that much revenue are Facebook, Apple, Google, and Amazon. And the way that they're choosing to collect the revenue, they're, for example, excluding Spotify since it has a subscription service. So the perception is that it's discriminatory against American companies. So my sense is that this is going to be a big fight if the French do at the end of the year go ahead and start actually assessing this tax and collecting it. The United States is likely to take action and impose tariffs against all of the French wine and cheeses, et cetera. And we're headed for a dispute down this. Far better would be to have this big OECD meeting where everybody agrees what's a fair way to tax all of this digital revenue, because the perception is that it's not being done correctly right now. And we need a better solution. The problem is it starts to become this nexus between, again, for a long time, if you will, the lane over here for tax purposes was income taxes. And the perception was the tax treaties and the tax groupies govern income tax, and that the trade groupies and the trade rules govern tariffs. Now that you have all of this trade in digital goods and digital services, the question starts to come, which is it? I mean, is this income that we're taxing, or is this actual trade? Because those digital goods are clearly crossing a border somewhere up in the iCloud space, somewhere up in the cloud, in the atmosphere. These goods are clearly being exported and imported, even though it's all being done digitally. So should this be treated more like a trade item subject to a tariff or a tax once it crosses the border? And so what you're happening in part is a concern over, income issues. And what you're also happening is an erasing of the line between international tax and international tariffs because of the use of digital as a way to trade that we never had before. So it is clearly one of the big looming fights, and whether we can get anything done at the OECD or not is really the big question.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, if we could have a fairly succinct answer. Do you expect to see a wave of reshoring as a result of coronavirus, perhaps using 3D printing to manufacture items?
Yes, I do. How significant remains to be seen. You're already seeing some of that. I mean, I just read a little story this morning about an Italian hospital that was running out of valves, and the next door local supplier that had a 3D printer came in and 3D printed all the valves that the hospital needed. I think you will see more of that for anything that can be done with 3D printing, and 3D printing these days can do an awful lot. So to some degree, yes. But in other ways, what we're seeing is those companies that are moving out of China are largely moving to Vietnam and Mexico, not necessarily to the United States. But I think the big winners of the offshoring will likely be, like I said, Vietnam, Mexico, and some other places. Those US companies that went into China in order to sell in China are likely not going to move out of China. Those that went into China because they were looking for cheap labor are probably going to move. Those that went into China because they need access to minerals and certain things that are only available in China probably are going to stay in China. So the answer is largely it depends, but by and large, those that went to China for cheap labor, yes, they are going to offshore, but probably not necessarily to the US.